If you want to get started in multifamily investing, one of the basic fundamentals that you need to know and understand is what are the different asset classes? What are the types of properties that you can buy in multifamily? There's Class A, Class B, Class C, Class D, but what do those things really mean? In this video, we're going to take a deeper dive into it. I'm Veena Jetti, and if you stick around till the end, I'm even going to share my favorite asset class and why. Let's take a closer look at the different types of asset classes within multifamily. But before we do that, let's talk about what is multifamily. Multifamily is simply the purchase of many residential units all under one roof. And typically we define it as 5 units or more. I personally specialize in over 200 units, and so we go after what we call large multifamily assets. In our portfolio, we've transacted on over $800 million of assets to date. So I want to talk to you guys about what the different asset classes are, and also at the end of the video, I'm going to tell you what my favorite is. What are the different classes of multifamily? The class system in real estate was created as a way of conveying the characteristics of a potential real estate investment. The classes, you have A, B, C, and D, are all based on a combination of physical, geographic, and demographic characteristic. Each class represents a different level of risk and return. Now, depending on what your investor profile is or what your business strategy is, you might decide to go into Class A or Class B or Class C or Class D. And there's different ways to look at it, but there's ways to make money in each of the asset classes. I personally think that there's one that's better than the rest, but let's talk about what they are and see why each asset class is worthy of investing into in the first place. What factors affect the classification of an asset? Well, there are 4 main ones. It's location, the age of the building, the property condition, and the amenities. It's important to note that when we're talking about different classes of multifamily buildings, I might think something is a Class B asset, whereas you might look at the same asset and think it's an A-. So it's a highly subjective interpretation of what the building is, and it varies from property to property, which can make it really difficult to narrow down on it. But as long as you know what your criteria is for evaluating buildings and what the criteria you use to determine if it's A, B, C, or D, you can maintain consistency in your business. Another important note on these 4 characteristics of determining which asset class you're investing into is that location and age of the building, you can't really change those, right? You're going to go into an asset and it's not going to move and it's not going to get any newer. So those are things that you cannot move or you cannot change. But the property condition and the amenities are easily changeable. So by going in and adding amenities or repairing things that need to be repaired, you're now affecting the property condition. And those are things that are easy to change, and you can plan for those and budget those when going into an asset during acquisition. The first asset class that we're going to talk about is Class A assets. Class A assets are usually the nicest and most expensive of all the asset classes. Some of the characteristics in Class A buildings include they are lower risk investments because they're more stabilized. They generally produce lower returns because they're lower risk. It's called a risk-adjusted return. The lower the risk, the lower the return. The higher the risk, the higher the return. They're usually very high quality because they are newer build, so it might be a 2022 or 2020 or 2021 build. So they're a newer building, they're higher quality, which means that they also have lower maintenance. The deferred maintenance costs are also typically lower because generally, if a roof is only 3 years old, usually it doesn't need to be replaced. With the caveat, if you're in a high hurricane or hail area, maybe it does. But generally speaking, you can count on all the building systems to be newer and not really need a whole lot of deferred maintenance costs. High income and good credit tenant base is another characteristic of a Class A asset, generally because these are more expensive to rent out. You'll see tenant bases that can afford a higher rent. And there are first class amenities. So these types of properties, you might see a door person, you might have a valet, you might have an elevator in the building. Again, determining if this is a Class A or B building is highly subjective. And another note is you can determine the class of building not just based on these characteristics, but also on the location. So you could have a Class A asset in a Class B area or a Class B asset in a Class A area. So just important nuances to know as you're looking at new assets. The next type of asset class that we want to talk about are Class B assets. Class B assets are generally high quality assets in middle income areas. Some of the characteristics they include are they're lower to moderate risk investments, they're moderate to higher returns, and they have good quality with potential. So they maybe have some amount of value add in them. It's a good risk to reward ratio. They also have a minimal amount of maintenance on the property, and the deferred maintenance costs are usually pretty low, but again, it depends on the asset. A 1980s asset might have higher deferred maintenance costs than a Class B 2000 build. So again, property is dependent, and you want to make sure you're paying attention to those. Then you want to look at the tenant base. On a Class B asset, we're going to have middle income and generally a good credit tenant base. These are typically your tenants that are stopping here to save for their first home purchase, and they'll move out of these assets and buy their starter home. That's typically the type of tenant you can expect on this type of an asset. And they still have desirable amenities. They may not have an elevator or a door person or a valet, but they will usually have a dog park, grills, a business center, a clubhouse, a pool, things like that. Class C assets are generally called workforce housing, and they're in working class areas. Characteristics of Class C assets include a moderate to higher risk profile, but in exchange you get higher returns because it's part of the risk reward profile. You also generally see higher maintenance costs on these types of assets and higher deferred maintenance costs. So that might mean that you now need to start replacing building systems like plumbing or HVAC or roofing, which you could need to do on other asset classes, but typically Class C, we always plan for that. We also have higher delinquency and bad debt because the tenants typically are lower credit tenants. Usually both adults in the household need to be working in order to make ends meet. So we want to make sure that we're underwriting and, in other words, planning for higher delinquency and higher bad debt so that we're not surprised when the property's cash flow is a little bit off from where we initially thought it would be. And there's little to no amenities in these areas. There's not usually a dog park. There's not usually a pool. These tenants don't really care as much about those amenities. They're really just looking for a clean, nice place to live so that they can live their lives, go to work, come home, and they're in a nice community. Class D assets are the fourth asset type in multifamily assets. Class D assets are the highest risk and also potentially the highest reward asset in lower income areas. Their characteristics tend to include a significant risk, and this is all relative to other classes of real estate. It doesn't mean that it's significantly risky as an investment because real estate as a whole is a generally stable investment class. It's a good part of a diversified portfolio. You also see higher returns, and that's because you're taking on a greater level of risk in this asset than you would in a Class C or B or A asset. You might see Section 8 tenants here, which means they are subsidized by the government. You will probably see more turnover, more repair requests, and these are generally lower income areas where the credit profile of the tenants is a little bit lower. Mainly because they don't have a lot of extra income or disposable income once the basic necessities are paid for. And these are almost always older buildings in areas that are not as economically developed as other areas. So you might ask me, what is my favorite asset class? And I'm going to tell you, and I'm going to tell you why. But before we do that, I just want to point out that this is very subjective. I know I mentioned it a little bit earlier, but I want to really stress that because, for example, a building could be a solid Class B building, but also have an elevator. Having an elevator alone doesn't necessarily make it a Class A asset. It might make it a Class B plus asset or a B asset with A class amenities. So it really depends on who's looking at it, and what you're going to want to do is maintain a criteria internally that you're using to benchmark every deal you're looking at. So even though you might think it's a A minus asset and I might think it's a B plus asset, that's okay as long as you maintain consistency when you're evaluating your deals. Okay, now for the big question, what is my favorite asset class? It is absolutely, without a doubt, hands down, Class B multifamily assets, which I know might be counterintuitive. A lot of people think, oh, well, Class A is the nicest. That's going to be your favorite asset class. Or Class C or D returns much higher returns to investors. So that's your favorite asset class. But for me, it's not, because I want the risk-adjusted return. I want a relatively low risk with a relatively higher return. And Class B assets really deliver that, especially in the value add space that we operate in. So being able to go in, renovate the building, improve the property condition, add amenities, or spruce up existing amenities allows us to really maximize the returns while maintaining a lower risk profile. And we can generate really high returns comparatively to other asset classes. And a little tip is there's something called a Sharpe ratio. A Sharpe ratio is what we use as a mathematical equation to really measure the risk of any investment, not just multifamily, but any investment. And it basically measures your standard deviations of risk comparative or relative to the reward you get. And fun fact is multifamily has the highest Sharpe ratio of any asset class historically for the last several decades. So multifamily as a whole is my favorite asset class, but with Class B specifically being my holy grail of assets. Thanks for joining me in this video. If you enjoyed learning about the different asset classes in multifamily and what my favorite is and why, make sure you click the link below to learn more. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed learning about the different classes of multifamily real estate and you want to learn more about how you too can get started, make sure you subscribe, ring the bell, and watch my next video.